We're back. It's been a long time, and it's been a busy season for us. We're we're happy to be back. Um, I think. Are you happy to be back, Miriam?
I'm so happy to be back. And it was interesting having a break and also then recognizing, oh no, this is something we really want to talk about. And what's really interesting is we're talking today about listening circles, which is of course such a foundational training and modality that we've used. And to come back to it now just feels, yeah, really rich.
Yeah, and I think it's so foundational for us that we've given a lot of time to other things that
Yep.
we use that um maybe we just got sick of talking about listening circles because they're
I
so
actually think we
fundamental.
might have. I think it's so foundational. We're just like, oh, everyone knows about that. But then I looked back at all our podcast and realized we actually haven't talked about it. And it is so important. And it is something that, yeah, is at the center of so much of what we do.
And we were talking about this yesterday, how it is so it is so foundational to what we do. Um, and it shows up in so much of our work, whether we're consulting with an organization and running an informal listening circle as a check-in, or when we're out in the field, having a storytelling circles around the campfire, or where people are just checking in about their day, or they're telling the story of their fast, or sharing the story of their life. But we do those trainings so people can integrate it into what they're doing as well. And that's all available online. But what we're going to talk about today is kind of an update on our thinking around the nervous system in listening circles.
And I think as we're seeing more of this research come out, part of which we're instigating with the University of Utah, we're seeing that the listening circle practice and tool alongside nature and the combination of those are really becoming important alternate therapeutic tools that are non-clinical. Talking to a few different very prominent psychologists over the last month, they're just really emphasizing the importance of these type of tools in terms of solving some of the social, cultural, mental health problems that we're having.
So I want to start off with a little anecdote. I was I was in a prison a couple weeks ago, um, doing a listening circle or a council training. It's a similar form, with a group of inmates, and we're training them to be facilitators. And one of them, we were talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we'll go over a little bit of that here. And one of the guys, after we talked about some like downregulation techniques and the impact that facilitators can have on the sort of collective nervous system of the group. And one of the guys raised his hand and he said, I'm always hearing that I shouldn't be hyper vigilant, but being hyper vigilant is how I survive in here. And he said, but I'm calm inside, but I'm always aware of what's going on around me. And we had this conversation about it. And his argument was basically, I need my nervous system activated in the sympathetic mode. And we'll kind of unpack that a little bit more in a moment. In other words, I need to be stressed out in order to survive. I need to be vigilant in order to not get into trouble or harm in prison. And my response to him was, I obviously, this environment better. No one's telling you how you're supposed to be. What we're showing is this is the way our nervous systems work. And when we are in that stress activation or threat activation or sympathetic activation, we will tend to see the world as dangerous. That doesn't mean the world is not dangerous, but it impacts our ability to respond to it objectively. In other words, we're reacting. And also, you don't have to be in a dangerous environment to be activated. So I'm saying that, Miriam, because when you were talking about a social benefit, I said at that time, when I look around, like people are crazy. Like we are all, and I include myself in this. I don't include you in this, Miriam, but you can include yourself if you were being honest.
Did you just voluntold me?
We, we are all, in general, most of the people I'm interacting with or we're interacting with every day are in this hyper activated state of stress. And the effect of that is the world that we live in, right? So social media is a good example of it, where it's all recorded. Anytime we're driving down the highway, and it seems like everybody's in a hurry to get somewhere and you all end up in the same place at about the same time. But taking risks to get one car ahead or whatever, that's, to me, that's part of the danger of the stress system being activated all the time, and perceiving danger or competition all the time has an impact on individuals. It has an impact on groups. And what we're going to talk a little bit more about is how that impacts us in high tension situations, or in any situation, because we're elevating the tension, not because the stakes are high objectively, but because they're high for us according to the way that our nervous system and our hormones are responding to perceived threat.
We've got so many examples of this over the years, but I'm particularly remembering during COVID, we held a number of online listening circles, and there were, people from all around the world were coming, and also the things that were happening around race and cultural change. And I just remember coming into those circles, and people were literally, their shoulders were up by, and there was this tension, and just during the circle feeling it relax, and remembering at the end of many of those circles just having this feeling. And again, a lot of diversity in the circle, people from different cultures, different races, different colors skin, different walks of life, different experiences of COVID in the hospital or at home, or and to be able to see at the end of those circles a kind of regulation happening, and even, I would say, a joy that it was even possible. And as you were talking, Adam, I realized, I think partly coming back to this now, is that we have been really busy over the last couple of years taking people into the wilderness. We've been doing a lot of that since COVID, actually. And I think it becomes very noticeable, and you're bringing up the state of culture in the world, but becomes very noticeable, or we notice it a lot, because we're taking people into an environment where there are no phones, where we're walking in, there's no traffic. We're cut off from that daily kind of rhythm and chaos of the world. There's no social media. And you can feel and see in individuals, in myself, in the group, a dramatic change over a very short amount of time. And then we come back. And so, and what we hear over the years to come, and we hold circles after the wilderness events, is people come and sit back in those circles and they feel immediately different, or like it's a space apart from the world that we live in. So I think that's given us also a unique perspective on, okay, looking at this as a practice, as a tool, and particularly in light of, what we are seeing in terms of mental health and nervous system escalation in groups and individuals. And we're starting to get that not only from our, experiences, it's very obvious, but we're starting to see it in the science and the neuroscience, which is really encouraging, because to have this introduced, this and the connection to nature, accepted and mainstreamed and introduced as ways that we can kind of come back into a different rhythm, I think is going to become even more and more important as we're reliant on AI and digital tools.
I'm thinking of the guy that showed up on our last one in Alaska and slept for 36 hours or something, because he was so upregulated, and he got there and realized his nervous system, I guess, or subconsciously, he realized he was safe and he could calm down, and he just slept and slept and slept. I'm going to pull up some slides. We've never done this before. Hopefully this worked out.
Slides.
You're watching this video. But I'll talk it through if you're just listening. Yeah. So this is like the basic model of the autonomic nervous system. grossly oversimplified, but a lot of what we're talking about today, like we're not neuroscientists, we're not pretending to be. I like to think about them as just mental models that help us understand what's going on, and knowing that there's objective science behind it can be useful when we're thinking or we're explaining to a group, like we might be in a threat activation state that which is objectively happening within our nervous system and maybe affecting the way we're seeing things, versus maybe we could look at this differently, right? So it gives a little bit of science behind it. So this is the sympathetic. We draw two lines here. If you're just listening, two horizontal lines that are parallel to each other, and the autonomic nervous system is throughout the day constantly cycling between sympathetic and parasympathetic activation or responses. And sympathetic we associate with stress, so higher heart rate, faster breathing, things like digestion and higher level thinking and processing and memory and all those things start to collapse a little bit. And in parasympathetic, the word we use there is peace, to remember that. Heart rate's lowering, blood pressure's lowering. We are digesting both physically, we can digest food, we can restore muscle damage, we can learn and incorporate memories and into our, or we can remember things, and we can process information better. And so we're constantly going between these two states, or more leaning in one direction and then to the other. And there is a natural wave pattern to this. Even thousands of years ago, the yoga practitioners knew that they would cover one nostril and breathe through the other, and go back and forth as a way of balancing these two systems. But what happens is, when we're constantly, usually in the sympathetic response, the very negative effects of sympathetic activation start to show up. So that's where we get chronic high blood pressure, heart attacks, other chronic diseases are starting to show up, and we're responding to life from a place of threat or conflict or stress. So we're reacting more quickly, and we'll go more into that. In parasympathetic, we can also become disordered in our parasympathetic response, where we've dropped below that bottom horizontal line, and we are in what would look like a dissociated state. So we might look calm and peaceful, but we are not experiencing anything. We're like tuned out, checked out.
That dead look that you get, Adam,
What?
in your eyes. It's that dead look you get in your eyes.
Yeah, I've been told that. Yes.
Don't talk to me now about anything important.
Yeah. And like,
well, I'm bouncing around in the sympathetic.
It's important to know this for people that are facilitating any kind of mindfulness practice, that looking calm and at peace, it does not necessarily is not necessarily a good thing. It could be dissociation. So an actual disconnect from the experience that we're having. So what the point is here, as a mental model, we want to move naturally between the two horizontal lines in what's called the resilient zone, where that natural cycle can be maintained, and not drop into the dissociated or hyper vigilant or hyperactivated sympathetic state, or dissociative parasympathetic state. So this used to be sort of explained in a really outdated way with this triune brain model, where it was explained as the reptilian brain, the basal ganglia, being the first part of our brain that evolved, which basically does the most essential functions of survival. The limbic, which responds like animalistically to the world, fight, flight, freeze, maybe gather, nurture, have been added to that. And the neocortex, which came late, the most recent, and we know that humans are the most evolved, and we're the most evolved culture that's ever existed. This is the idea behind it. That was actually not meant to be truth, but sarcasm. So the neocortex being that ability to think rationally, to reason, to imagine, and the idea was that when we do things like count backwards, we're going to activate the neocortex. And when we have a dysregulated fight, fight, or freeze response, the limbic system is at play, and then the reptilian brain is coming into play, and one system will override the other ones. So the idea is that we want our neocortex to be online at all times. But it doesn't really work like that, and that's not really how evolution happened. And the way that neuroscientists are looking at this now from a layman's perspective is as three major sort of a network of systems that are working at all times, but can gravitate towards one or the other. So that sympathetic response, or the movement outside of the resilient zone, is a threat response. Is a threat system activation. So that's when we're talking about hypervigilance, and stress, and the inability to think beyond, like us and them.
Survival mechanisms,
essentially. Protection, protective. That's the threat activation system. And when we're not in that state, we have the opportunity to be in this reflective system where we can think about our thinking, or meaning making, where we are actually able to like see ourselves as part of a bigger story. We can think about vision, mission, common goals, common aims, take the other person's perspective, etc.
And I want to add something as a mother of teenagers, and so also just seeing sort of in this generation, and I'm going to speak experientially, but they're starting to have data to prove this, and it's coming out. We're working with a college in Minnesota, and they're starting to talk about this generation that's coming up and has digital natives, basically, and seeing a much larger proportion of being activated in the threat system. And so it becomes really interesting to see, a few years on, how this is affecting us, on a daily basis. And the generation themselves are talking about that in their context of like the way that they feel kind of strung around. And you'll see a huge conversation happening in that generation about mental health. And also an acknowledgement that the things that we're using to solve the problem, medicine, therapy, are useful in some circumstances, but they're not a whole answer to the problem of what do we do with an activated nervous system, with it. What do we do when we're so far skewed to the threat system because we feel like everything from the world is ending because it's an environmental crisis, to it's unsteady because I'm not sure of the systems anymore because, school shut down during COVID, to I'm getting all this information on social media that's telling me that we're in threat all the time, or that I'm in competition with everyone all the time. And it's kind of accelerated it in this, I think for all of us, but particularly in this generation that are coming up now.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at the news feed, and it's threat after threat after threat after threat. It's whether it's something across on the other side of the world, it's it's tuning into conflict between different parties, and people that are really true believers of either party here in the United States, maybe around the world. It's the threat to our whole ecosystem, the whole environment, like climate threat, climate change threat, a threat to identity, to belonging. All of these things feel just as real to our nervous system and our subconscious as a dangerous person coming up to us on the street, or someone that we perceive to be dangerous, which the threat activation being the threat system being activated all the time means we will see other people walking up to us on the street as a threat because we're already in that state. And I want to talk a little bit about what is actually happening in that threat system, because I think it's useful. I'm thinking about groups and how we're working with them. But I'm going to actually speak to a little bit of real science as far as I know it. I'm faithful in the science that we're bringing today. They've done studies where they've proven that our minds actually know what's happening. So they'll put up a slide, right? And it's red, yellow, green, whatever. And they look at the activation of the brain. When someone saw yellow, it activates a certain part of the brain. When someone saw green, it activates some part of the brain, red, etc. And they've been able to measure those responses with such detail that even before the slide is fully on the screen, our brain is already has already responded to the color that's there. So the idea in that book was that, our brains are whole connected to this whole network system beyond our own individual. Our minds are connected to this whole system beyond our brains. But whether that's true or not, the amygdala, the threat response part of our brain, is responding to threats less than a second of them happening. So which is slower than our conscious mind. So if I pick up on body language, for example, that says threat to me, before I even have consciously aware that there might be a threat, my nervous system has already responded. So that whole system, which is, moving towards stress and response, is getting activated. So I'm already in fight, flight, freeze mode before I'm even conscious of the threat.
The whole thing about this, which is super interesting, which is a large part of our work, is that this is not just individually motivated, it's culturally held. So I want to give you a really simple example. My mum has just been here from Australia, and she's had a 3-week visit in the States. And it's very noticeable when you're very close to two cultures. So I'm very close to the Australian culture through my family, and I live here and my kids are basically American. And I can give 2 really clear examples. When you're in Australia and you're faced with a poisonous spider, it's not culturally very scary. It's just oh, there's a funnel web in the pool. We got to get that stick to get it out. What I notice in Americans, however, is they're oh my gosh, Australia is the most dangerous place on earth. When I see this spider, I'm going to freak out. When I see this snake, I'm going to freak out. That's just one example of the threat is felt very differently because it's held culturally very differently. And the same with my mum here. My mum was visiting in the States, and the gun laws are very different in America than they are in Australia. And I noticed in my mum that she was incredibly, the threat to her in that was so much stronger than it was in our family, for example, of the threat of gun violence, basically. And yes, it's true, there's more gun violence in the States than Australia. America's also very much a bigger country. Wherever you fall on that debate is kind of irrelevant. It was to what I'm saying here. It's more that my mum felt the threat in a different way because it's held differently culturally in Australia. So just 2 recent examples to say that the way that our threat system works is influenced by the people and the culture around us. And that becomes really important when we start to talk about the work that we do with groups and training in listening circles.
And that anybody does, really. Anytime that we're interacting with someone, to know that that they're even unaware of it, they may be subconsciously reacting to something that we're not even aware of, right? Or they're in this constantly activated state, and they come into a meeting, let's say, or a one-on-one or a group session of any kind, and because their threat system is activated for some reason that has nothing to do with the circumstances, but is very real. It might not be true to the situation, but it's very real for them. And then on top of that, we are all unconsciously responding to their nervous systems as well.
when we're in a new environment, so let's say I'm going to a new country, I'm not sure of the system, I'm not sure how it works, I'm not sure if I get sick, for example, or my kids get sick, where I take them to hospital and what to do, we get extra vigilant. So I'm just going to point back to the new generation or to what we're going now. There is so many changes happening at the moment in our systems and in the way that we're working because of the technological advances, that it's also causing a kind of hypervigilance of like, I don't know how this works. I don't know how to operate in this system. It's not set. And so we've got kind of like different influences coming from all different directions that are sort of activating this threat system in us.
And what's happening when it's activating confirmation bias? So we're going to stick with what we already think we know, right? It's a protective mechanism. We don't, the meaning making and reflection is where we can open up to new ideas, test our assumptions, etc. So, and unfortunately, we have a negative bias as human beings in general, which I think we've talked about on past podcasts. But basically, the story is our ancestors survived by being more afraid than welcoming, and so they passed on genes that would tend our thinking towards the negative. So even towards the like catastrophizing. I think just like looking at any religious tradition, including the scientific religion paradigm that we live in now, and it's constantly pointing to the great catastrophe, which will end it all. I think that's a bit of like an outgrowth of that negative bias. We tend to simplify our stories. So stereotypes goes along with confirmation biases, but we could look at this as like, well, it's always like that, or we've already done that, or those people are always like that, or he, she, they are always like that, right? So we're simplifying narratives because if we were actually if there was a physical threat to us, it wouldn't be useful to complexify the narrative. I think the Buddha said in the Dhammapada, right? Like if you've been shot by an arrow, you don't sit there and wonder about who made the arrow and how it was shot and all the reasons why you've been shot. You remove the arrow and you take care of the patient. So that's, about that threat. We want to simplify our brain wants to act quickly to reduce the threat or remove ourselves from the threat. At a basic level, one of the biggest threats to the human psyche is to not belong. Right, as social animals, we need to belong to survive. So not only is it nice to belong to something and feel like we're taken care of, and we're part of a community, a social group that's taking care of each other, but there's a real survival threat to not belonging, and that extends to things like our roles, that we're valued, that we feel valued, that we feel like we have worth, and that can come that. Those things can be threatened in many different ways, whether it's financial or the attitudes that people have to us, the way our ideas are valued, obviously identities, belonging or not belonging. So that can activate, and also those threats to those can be just as activating. And also, one of the great ways that people protect themselves from not belonging is to exclude others. So one of our responses can be to one up or push people out or divide a group to consciously or unconsciously ensure our continued belonging. And then, as Miriam was talking about, we've been talking about before, the emotional contagion. So if I come into this conversation stressed out, right, my threat system is activated, Miriam is going to respond to that. She's going to see my body language, even across the screen here, the tone of my voice, and probably at some level activate as well, and vice versa. And especially in person, that's happening just on the body language, even tuning into each other's breathing, unconsciously, we can escalate one another. And then it makes it even harder to downregulate alone. I'm going to use another prison story here real quick, but we were doing a game that we do a lot in open circle trainings, which is the counting to 20 game. And in a high threat environment, and where there's also a lot of threat activation, is a really hard game to play, because the whole point of the game is to basically wait and listen instinctively, but also pick up, allow the body, I think, to pick up on other body language that someone else is going to speak. So two people can't say the same number at one time, or the game starts over and you got to get to 20. So really hard if this threat activation system is going. But there was one guy who had his eyes closed the whole time, and he was breathing, just like basically meditating. And everyone else was counting really fast. 1, 2, 3. I'll start over. 1, 2, 3, 2, start over. And he would just sit there. And then when there was a long pause, or not even that long, he would go 4. And he never talked over anybody else, but he also never opened his eyes, right? So he was, from the outside looking in, he was doing this very hard thing to do, and he had to close his eyes to do it, which is regulating his own nervous system in the midst of all this energy. It was fun energy. It was like, we're going to do this game together. And it was frustrated energy because it was very hard to do. And so rather than let himself pick up on that, he had his eyes closed, and he would wait for this like perfect moment and then speak the number. I like to use those examples because I think they speak to, even in a game where these systems get in the way of us actually accomplishing our goals, and how we can downregulate within them.
I think one of the most helpful ways that this, and we'll put the slides in the show notes, one of the most helpful things about this way of defining what's going on within the threat system is you start to notice it. You're like, oh, people are defining it as us and them. There must be a threat system activation going on. And it's extreme. Like, one of the first things we notice in being able to do this as part of the listening circle practice is that in the recognition of it and in the witnessing of it, in yourself, but also in others, you're immediately activating the reflective system. And so immediately you're going into being able to do that. And I think one of the things I notice on a wider cultural or social level is that when we don't do that, we kind of buy into it and it escalates. That's the emotional contagion. It escalates, and we're escalating each other all of the time. And so that's one of the things that we're constantly calling the listening circle practice, and the learning of that style of leadership, leader as guide. We're constantly calling it a disruptive practice, or a disruptive way of interacting with a group or yourself. And I think it is disruptive, and we describe it that way because it asks us to stop and feed, in this case, the reflective system and the meaning-making systems, and also notice the threat system. Not saying that any of those are bad or better or worse than the others. The threat system is absolutely important, because when we're faced with a threat, we need to be able to protect ourselves. What we're saying here, and I think the message, is the ability to balance them out if one is over exaggerated, particularly in a group or a cultural situation. I mean, Adam's bringing up a kind of extreme example with the prison system, where it's activated, very easily and all the time. But there are many different situations that we've talked about here that take it out of balance.
I want to go over some of the things that we put together on, how the listening circles sort of deactivate the threat system, and talk through kind of what activates the system and and how listening circle deactivates it. And we're not going to go so much into the mechanics of the listening circles, but we have a training online you can do. I think there's one you can just do in your own time, and then we offer these on a regular basis, the practicum part of it. So I hope that if you're listening, if you made it this far into the podcast and you're listening to this, you're thinking about ways you can do this in other ways too. It doesn't have to be a listening circle, but the cool thing about a listening circle is, one way of thinking about it is a mindfulness practice done in a group. And so if you are working in groups, rather than offering a meditation before your board meeting, which may or may not fit the culture, having a check-in and checking in on people can serve two purposes. And by check-in, just going around a couple words that how are you arriving today? It's going to have the effect of deactivating the threat system. It's also going to help you as a facilitator read the field of what's been brought into the room. It also reduces some of the chit chat because people know they're going to be able to share that. So it's a really, really useful tool. And I think we think one of the best for working with groups, but it's not the only one, obviously. So listening circle provides predictability and structure, right? So a lot of the things that we've talked about, activating the threat system is unpredictability. Miriam talked about going into a new culture, not understanding the spoken and unspoken norms of a culture can make us feel fearful or stressed out. We don't understand how things work. Threat system is activated. So just like the rituals that happen in many religious situations, the structure and predictability allows us to relax so we can tune into something bigger. In this case, at the most basic level, other people. At a higher level, the vision of a group or the goals or the purpose that working through the conflict might bring forth. Slowing down a conversation, which Miriam and I should do better on these podcasts, also allows us to reduce the nervous system escalation. So think of any argument that you've ever had, it probably at some point, people start talking over each other or start, responding very quickly to the other person. And slowing that down allows us to pause, to reflect, to breathe, to notice what's happening in ourselves and in the group of two or more. And our nervous system can respond beyond that threat and start to activate some of those other systems. It also helps a group co-regulate. So just taking that time as a whole group is like an informal mindfulness breath, right? In a listening circle, we'll do popcorn style, sometimes where people share when they're ready, and there can be these long pauses, and it gives time for maybe to look around or to take a deeper breath once we get over the awkwardness of the silence. I think this next one's really important, but Miriam, I want to give you before I go to that.
Oh, I just wanted to say, as you were talking, I think what's really important, because some of you listening might be associating a listening circle with particular experiences that you've had sitting in circle. And I think one of the things that is really important as you listen to this is that a listening circle does not need to be culturally endowed. It doesn't need to represent a particular belief system, for example. It is a tool that is cross-cultural. And I think I'm saying that because I'm recognizing in a conversation I had with one of my children earlier today, I'm recognizing how we were doing that co-regulation, using it, but there was no cultural endowment around it. And I think part of what I think we are advocating for is both, yes, the practice, but this being a tool that you can learn and use every day in situations that you come across.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the difference between practice and tool, right? So in a check-in meeting, we're using that. I'm going to go back through those things, the predictability and the structure, where it's successful in every board meeting, for example, we know that there's going to be a check-in, right? It's predictable. The practice, doing this stuff for so many years, has taught us that how to create that predictable structure in different cultural environments. So we're not going to light a candle and, I've been in groups where there's prayer and there's a Jesus carving at the center of the group. Like that's one cultural way of holding a circle. And also in a board meeting, it's just on the agenda, check in 5 to 10 minutes. How are you arriving today? But the practice has shown us how to do that in different environments. So having that very predictable structure allows us again to um, reflect on how and understand what's happening in the group and what's the most appropriate response. The other thing that I think is really important, and I thought you were going to say this, Miriam, when you were talking about the like how we hold the listening circle. In contrast to a lot of like what I would consider immature like circle groups, where it's more like a call and response or group therapy or group therapy that's not therapy, like new age group stuff. There's no confirmation bias or stereotyping happening there. But you know what I'm talking about. Um, we, in our groups, there's no responding. So let's use that check-in example. Nobody's saying, "Oh, that's great that you're arriving. Really happy because we got a lot to do today." Or I share something like I just lost a pet or something. Oh, like I'm so sorry. Can we do it? Like none of that's happening. And I think that that's one of the most important things for this regulation system. And I think it may be more true in groups of men, but I'm not sure. That's just, I tend to.
Oh no, it's so true.
No, I think the safety part of like, I think men don't share their feelings or share what's real for them sometimes, maybe more often than women, because they don't want advice. They don't want to be responded to. It's really important for men. And again, this could extend, but I'm just speaking as a man, to be able to share what's going on for them without any feedback. And so I think knowing that we're not going to get feedback, that we're not going to be judged, whether it's the judgment of caretaking or caregiving, or the judgment of, you're a weak person or something. That can be a down regulation tool in itself. Knowing I'm going to share something that might be heavy and hard and I don't have to hear about it later allows me to share it better.
Yeah, I think what I've seen it disrupt in women is competition.
Yeah.
And in a group environment. And often that goes into the in and the out group. So it's possible. And again, I've seen in immature circle practices that it actually it actually brings that up. Well, you're in, you're out. But in more mature circle practices, it disrupts that in more women focused groups. And and I think when I was talking before about wanting to talk about the way that we hold it, it was to point to that, because I've seen so many immature circle practices not not be a regulatory tool, because they say this makes you in this group and this makes you out, and so and that's fine if someone wants to do that, but then it stops that capacity for it to regulate in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah. The other thing that's, I think, really important really important part of this, and it wasn't until like uncovering some of this research, the newer research on the brain in reflection, I think we have a new way of explaining why this is important, but the witnessing. So at the end of a circle, we have various ways of witnessing back what we heard. So I'm going to give one example, which is like the most basic level, of each person saying one thing that stood out for them. And the key here for me, as in the practice sense of this, is to not explain why, because then we're sort of containing, it's like backhanded advice sometimes, or backhanded, I'm with you, and therefore I'm not with somebody else. So it becomes validation. It's also definitely not advice or, here's what you should do. It's just, I heard someone say, I'm having a tough day. And then the next person will share, I heard someone say, I had a great weekend, right? It doesn't, and there's in that, like reflecting back what has been heard without any judgment. I believe it does bring up that reflective capacity, because one, we're remembering, we're engaging this practice of not, maybe we notice, I want to reflect this back because I really I really feel the same way, but I'm not going to say it. Like I'm going to let that go, and I'm just going to share that really stood out for me, and let it be mysterious to myself, and let it be what it is, really. And I think that there's if we're going to go back to that neocortex model, that's a huge self-regulation process. And at the same time, it's helping the group make meaning of what just happened without one person containing it within, like we say, tying it all up in a bow, like we might do in a stereotypical like group therapy session. Or again, immature facilitators might say, well, thank you all for sharing so deeply today, which again, it sort of limits, well, I'm agreeing or disagreeing with that person that was deep, rather than like continuing to reflect on in an evolving way on what just happened.
It's really, I agree with you. This new research is really useful for us to explain the power and probably the difference between immature and mature practices of this. Because the other feedback that we constantly get from groups and people we work with is that they feel there's a sense of safety. And that safety is expressed by them in being able to talk about and share stories that perhaps they never have before. Even in years and years of therapy, like the sort of feedback that we're getting is people are like, that leaped over 20 years of therapy. And so one of the things that we're seeing when people, for example, in a wilderness program are doing this over the course of many days and gradually, oh, well, okay, this is the structure. Okay, I can trust this. And all of those things that Adam's been talking about are activated. There is nothing that Adam and I are doing or other open circle facilitators are doing to keep those participants safe. It is the practice itself and the repetition of it that does it. And I think that's a huge kind of awareness that we bring, as we translate this into, yes, the listening circle practice, but also, for example, next year, we're translating it into a lot of trainings for people to mentor young adults who are at risk, or to peer-led circles with veterans or first responders, all of whom have experienced a lot of trauma. It's this acknowledgement that it's not the person, the mentor, or the person leading the circle or leading the peer-led group that makes it safe. It's actually the repetition of that process, and with the very particular elements that Adam has been pointing to. And again, that's kind of what we want to bring into the world more fully, for people to be able to use, not to practice it the way we do, but to bring those principles in being able to use this as an effective capacity and tool to down-regulate and be able to walk with people in the world and walk with groups in the world in a more effective way through a lot of crisis and through a lot of change.
So I'm gonna like end this with one story, and I know I'm gonna get it a little wrong because I didn't check all my details on this before, but you can Google it and find out where I was wrong, but also find out where I was right, which will be where it matters. So the story of these listening circles, like the first time that Europeans encountered it, modern Europeans encountered it, was in North America. And Benjamin Franklin, and it's recorded in this account. And I'm saying that because all of us had lots of circle practices in our cultures from long ago, and many continuing to this day. But Benjamin Franklin was struck by this experience he had with the Iroquois nations. And there was big trouble happening among the different nations within the Iroquois, the tribes within the nation. And so he went to this council meeting, a council of all the tribes, and he was expecting them, I guess, to kind of hash it out in the way that they do in British Parliament, but basically to have a debate over what to do. And what he witnessed was that the chiefs of all the tribes sat in a circle, and they told, one by one, they told stories. And some of them, I think, seemed relevant to what was happening, what the issue at hand was, and some of them didn't seem relevant to what was happening. But in between each speaker, one person would speak at a time, no one would respond, and they would wait, I think he said 15 minutes before the next person spoke. And there wasn't like a timekeeper. It was just a natural silence. And each chief told a story. And then the women who had been standing around the outside understood what was to be done to solve the problem, to address the issue. And I think that that's like the best example of this, I would say, embodied understanding of this, of how we can work better in groups, culturally embodied. One person speaking at a time, long silences, and then letting women make the decision. No, I think, letting the meaning making happen outside of the, partially outside of the responsibility for taking action, right?
Yeah.
Because in the high stakes of having that direct responsibility of being a sort of figurehead, and I think we so associate like decisiveness with those leaders, which are usually male and overly busy, and obviously to get in those positions, they have to be, and women too have to be, very sort of, you have to be threat activated all the time, right? To be in those high stress positions, but to allow the meaning making to sort of be separated from the action within the group. And more importantly, and I think more applicable to what we can transfer to our day-to-day life is, slowing that pace down, predictable environment, and, not needing to, and connecting through stories rather than having to figure out the right answer and argue for it, which leads to escalation and not regulation in the nervous system sense.
You can do a fact check if you're at home.
Yeah, I got it pretty much right. And it's
Write the
it's
note
archetypal.
with that off.
It's archetypal, so it doesn't have to be all right.
Yeah, archetypal, yeah. And also, we are going to, in this kind of after this gap with Beyond Listening, a few years ago during COVID and a little bit after it, we recorded a lot of material around this system, which foundationally is based in this understanding. And we are going to start releasing some of that just so that you can receive some of the research and the thinking and the paradigm that this is coming from.
I think, it's really, we tried to make that program really practical. So we're looking at how to use this in a number of different contexts where action is required. It's not a practice. It's it's being used as a practice to some degree, but primarily as a tool to achieve the aims of an organization, which we hope is how it will be used, because so much suffering and wasted time and money is happening.
And so we hope that this is helpful. Again, in the show notes, you'll see the presentation, and you can look out for the trainings that are coming up, or reach out and we can talk more about this way of moving through the world.
Or just, just know that your brain is constructing the universe, and step out of the matrix and be free.
And we'll leave it there. Freedom and matrix. Thank you so much. It's good to be back. More soon.